Well, hi there. We are talking today to Dr. Hunter Reed of the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. Dr. Reed is a wildlife veterinarian for them. So why don't you start, Dr. Reed, by telling us what you do for TPWD, and welcome to our program.
Cool. Well, no, thank you for having me on today. Like you said, I'm Dr. Hunter Reed, one of the wildlife veterinarians at Texas Parks and Wildlife. It's a very fun job. I'm originally from Central Minnesota. Went to school at Cornell University of Minnesota for Masters of Public Health and Veterinary degrees, but came down here to become a field epidemiologist for Texas Animal Health Commission, but ultimately switched over to the Parks and Wildlife side, where I work with a bunch of different species like bats, bighorn sheep, horned lizards, and waterfowl, and of course, deer. And do a lot of different things at the Parks and Wildlife Department, and much of my time, 70% of it's spent on the road, giving presentations, training staff and landowners, doing diagnostic testing and these investigations, but also doing cooperative wildlife research with universities across the country.
Very interesting. That does sound like a fun job. So one of the things really what we want to talk to you about today, we did about a year ago, we did a presentation, or we did a program, an episode, I should say, about CWD. That's chronic wasting disease. And we talked to Mitch Lockwood, and Mitch is the state's big game program director with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. And we were hoping that you could give us an update on CWD, the state of it now, because it has been a year since we talked to Mitch, and it's, I know it's developing probably daily. You guys are, things may be changing for you really quickly, but if you could, for folks who didn't hear our episode with Mitch and who might not be familiar, could you just start off with what CWD is and what causes it, et cetera?
Yeah, absolutely. I work closely with Mitch, and it's certainly an evolving issue here in Texas. So CWD is it's an always fatal neurodegenerative disease, a susceptible cervid species. In Texas, that includes white-tailed deer, mule deer, elk, cycadeer, and red deer. So the agent of that disease is a prion, which is a misfolded protein. The prion protein in its normal shape serves a lot of different cellular functions. None that has been particularly isolated as the individual function, but has roles in cell signaling, ion transport, neuroprotection, including others. But when that structure, 3D shape, that prion is changed into its abnormal or infectious shape, this can lead to biological chain reaction, resulting in the conversion of other normal prions to their abnormal or infectious state. Over time, that can accumulates and forms plaques of these abnormal prions, and it can lead to neurological damage to tissues and cause clinical signs such as incoordination, depression, loss of fear, and eventually results in death.
About how quickly does the disease progress once an animal gets it?
Yeah, so typically for white-tailed deer, at least, it takes about 18 to 24 months after infection before that animal starts to show clinical signs, or essentially symptoms of the disease. And then once they start to show clinical signs, it can be a rapid, basically they rapidly, deteriorate, and then pass away. Yeah. For elk, other species like red deer, that can take on the order of a couple of years or more, but still the end result is the same.
Okay. So you mentioned elk and red deer. I have a question. Has there been confirmed cases in David or Barasinga as well?
I don't actually know. I don't deal with those in Texas, but I believe not.
Okay, I just know that they're also cervids, so I would assume that they had some sort of susceptibility to it.
Yeah, and that brings up an interesting point that not all cervids are actually susceptible to the disease. So as of right now, natural infections have not been documented, say axis deer, which are another free-ranging cervid within Texas. However, that may change with research that we're actually contributing to.
That's very, very interesting. It's just how widespread is CWD in Texas right now, and where has it been newly discovered over the past year?
Yeah, so CWD, like any other infectious agent, can be spread through a variety of different routes. CWD is pretty easily transmitted through direct animal contact or live deer movement, but also can be spread through environmental contamination, through infected feces, urine, saliva into the surrounding environment. So the combination of the two has led to kind of the expansion of the disease across the United States, but also internationally. Currently, within Texas, though, we have 16 Texas counties affected or have had a detection of CWD. And with of those animals with detections, is around 410 testing positive. 80% of those are from captive facilities, and the remaining 20% have been found in kind of free range settings. And then right now in Texas, we actually have 10 zones. 7 of those have free-ranging deer or free-ranging positive deer. 6 of them have been created in response to detections in 15 different captive whitetail deer breeding facilities. And then just in the past year, we've added on 2 new captive deer facilities that have been infected with CWD. And one of them was found in Limestone County. The other was found in Gillespie County. And we detected those through just regular postmortem surveillance, testing of lymph nodes and OBEX. But possibly as a result of changes that we underwent last year in our breeder regulation or rules for their baseline surveillance every year, we changed that from 80% postmortem testing requirement to 100%. So that increased our ability to detect the disease in those facilities. And just in the last couple of weeks, we've had another recent detection of an animal at a release site within the Hunt County CWD zone, which is near the positive breeding facility there.
Okay, so you mentioned breeding facilities, and this might seem weird to folks from other states, but in Texas, we have a lot of deer breeding facilities, and surely CWD is affecting them. How are they dealing with it? What steps are they taking to deal with the disease?
Yeah, no, Texas certainly has a lot of captive deer breeding facilities. In fact, it's somewhere around 800 scattered state. Yeah, no, and so just because of the nature of those facilities in terms of having a substantial amount of movement and also interconnectedness between those breeding facilities here within Texas, there is an inherently greater risk of transmission just because of that high degree of movement. So that can ultimately mean that if a facility does become positive through our epidemiological investigations, we can quickly get dozens to sometimes hundreds of facilities that become exposed by CWD exposed animals.
Okay, wow. So you mentioned earlier that there's 100% testing now after an animal dies. I wasn't sure if you were talking about an animal that's harvested through hunting or just at a breeding facility. Can you give a little more detail about that? And also what other steps Texas Parks and Wildlife is doing to get CWD under control in the state?
Yeah. So when I was talking about the 100% postmortem testing there, that was restricted to the animals that die naturally within breeding facilities. Okay. Not be harvested within those facilities, but would have to be harvested on a release site after a transfer occurred. Currently, those release sites don't have a 100% testing requirement just within those breeding facilities. But to kind of account for the greater risk of transmission and then also propagation of the disease. Animals within breeding facilities have a higher density and part of that is they're over less area. So because you have a higher degree of animal contact and also a smaller area that you're spreading those prions over, if they are present, it can lead to a rapid increase in the prevalence of the disease within that facility. So to kind of account for all of that, we've made quite a few key changes to our rules in the last year, just last fall, actually. So part of that was the 100% postmortem testing requirement. We also instituted a minimum mortality rate of about 5% across that herd. If they don't meet the 5%, additional testing, antemortem testing requirements of tonsil or rectal tissue for CWD have to be performed for 5 animals for each one mortality missed or needed. Also, we buffed up our submission requirements. So all samples have to be submitted within 7 days so that we can respond to positive detections in a more timely fashion. And then also we have added antemortem testing of 100% of the deer going to release sites. So all deer must have a not detected test result before they get transferred to a release site. That's just to assure that those animals have a lower risk of being infected with CWD, but it certainly does not mean that that individual animal is free of CWD. So all of those are beneficial in increasing our overall detection probability, and allows us to find CWD where it exists sooner so we can better contain it and protect captive and free-ranging deer populations.
Okay. Can you give it an estimate or a rating or something about how easily spread this is? I think we might call that how contagious it is if we were talking about a pathogen, but we're talking about a prion here. So contagious probably isn't the word. I don't know what word to use, but how easily is it spread from one animal to another?
Yeah, so that can be a hard question to answer. In certain parts of the United States where you can have higher deer densities, where you might have movement of animals over larger areas, and that can obviously vary on the species too. So white-tailed deer tend to have smaller home ranges compared to elk, mule deer. So that can be a contributing factor influencing the overall ability of that disease to propagate. But also genetics plays a role. What we're finding out in Texas here is that at least within our free-ranging populations, we tend to have less susceptible genotypes or that make those deer relatively more resistant to infection of chronic wasting disease compared to more northern populations, which tend to show a little bit more susceptibility to it all. So the conglomerate of those factors can really influence how it develops or mushrooms, if you want to say, within that population. Currently within Texas right now, some of those factors of lower densities out in at least the Trans-Pecos and Panhandle, and then also more quote unquote resistant genotypes has seemed to really help us and kept the prevalence relatively low and stable over time, at least in the past 10 years since it's been detected.
Okay, interesting.
So if CWD were to become even more widespread, like really widespread and common in Texas, what are the implications for our economy, our wildlife, and our natural resources?
Yeah, so there's quite a few effects. Obviously, the initial biological effects really are that you're gonna end up with animals that are dying. So animals infected with CWD are somewhere on the order of around 4 times more likely to die than those that are not infected. And then also that increased mortality means that we can actually end up with shifts in age structure. So it tends to shift the age a little, or the average or median age a little bit lower. So that means you'll actually end up with less trophy animals kind of on that landscape. And this can all have a whole sort of downstream or indirect effects. Economically, hunters may have actually been shown to avoid areas affected with CWD, which can imperil certain rural economies and communities that depend on that for their more seasonal income. Obviously, there's an associated cost of managing and surveilling the disease. for Texas Parks and Wildlife. So we do have to respond to it. And that often means forming check stations, hiring seasonal staff and full-time staff, and then also paying for the testing alone. And then also some people at least have suggested that land values may have been detrimentally impacted. However, this really hasn't been seen consistently across Texas. It is a kind of anecdotal report. And then you also have kind of like the human related effects. So CWD positive animals are more likely to actually be hit by vehicles. So that can present more of kind of like a public health risk. You can also have CWD positive animals, especially as it relates to El Paso and the Franklin Mountains, where we do have higher prevalence of the disease. Animals are not afraid of humans. They'll be wandering through yards. So that can obviously be a little bit distressing if those animals have to be subsequently removed. And then also it could be dangerous for any people that come in close proximity to those animals. And then also the what do you want to say? The jury's not out on whether or not CWD is actually zoonotic. From recent research out of Texas, it appears that these North American strains of CWD actually show some of the greatest capacity for interspecies transmission. And then also some reports within non-human primates have suggested that CWD can actually be transmitted through the oral route. So as of right now, the public health authorities really still say caution to have caution and avoid eating the meat out of positive animals.
Okay. Yikes. That's kind of scary. Every time I talk to a friend who, or, every time this comes up with a friend who's not a wildlifer, who's just asking me about this. And of course, I'm not an expert, but excuse me, they always ask that question. So can people get it? And yeah, not really sure what to respond, but so I guess the answer is the jury is still out on that, huh?
Yeah. No, hopefully we start to learn a little bit more, because I know that the disease is starting to spread across the United States. It's starting to reach higher prevalences within the states that are infected. So it's going to be a growing and ever more present issue in everyone's day-to-day lives, especially hunters.
Yeah. And, I hadn't even thought about infected animals being more likely to be hit by a car. I guess that's just because they wouldn't have as fast reflexes and, be as fast enough to get out of the way. Is that it?
Yeah, so it obviously affects just like the basic motor functions of that animal, but also there's been evidence to suggest that it just actually makes them impacts the overall immune status. So some of these animals actually have concurrent pathologies. A lot of times it can be associated with pneumonia, which just inherently makes them less healthy, more vulnerable, not just the what do you want to say, car collisions, but also to being actually harvested and then also being predated on, whether that's mountain lions or coyotes or whatnot.
Okay. Interesting. There are so many cascading effects that you just don't think about.
Yeah, no, it's one of the more complex issues, and because of the Texas being almost 95+% private land, because it impacts so many people, a lot of people have varying perspectives as to the importance of CWD, but we really try and work with everyone, private and the public land that we do have, to try and manage this disease more as proactively as we can.
Yeah, it's got to make it a little more complicated that there are so many private landowners throughout Texas with all, like you say, varying perspectives. So it's interesting. Yeah, well, a little job security for you, I guess, though.
Absolutely. And I mean, we have a multi-pronged approach to kind of managing CWD. Obviously, cooperation, whether it's captive breeding facilities, or low fence ranches certainly assist with that. We tried with captive operations. We've adopted the rule changes that I've mentioned earlier, but we assist with Texas Animal Health Commission in tracing those animals, creating disease management plans, and containing infected and exposed properties. We also try in terms of free ranging deer. I certainly have job security, and big game department does, in terms of establishing these containment zones, surveillance zones, because we want to create mandatory testing and carcass movement restrictions. And the mandatory testing allows us to monitor the distribution and prevalence of the disease, while the carcass movement restrictions really are a preventative measure in terms of trying to keep the riskiest carcass parts left within the zone so they don't expose new areas. And then of course, part of that, what I do a lot of the time, I'm actually going to do this weekend in the Franklin Mountains, over in the Franklin Mountains, is research and outreach. So we collaborate with several universities in terms of, we're actually translocating some bighorn sheep and considering areas out there in West Texas. But also we give trainings and hold public meetings in areas that we create new zones for. And part of that training that I'll be doing in the Franklin Mountains is to train staff internally how to collect samples, but also to speak to landowners and researchers within the area and give them an update as well about chronic wasting disease and where research has come and what our future directions are. So yeah, plenty to do.
Right. Well, you touched on this a little bit, but I want a little more detail. What are the most important things, I guess, that land managers, who are managing for deer and hunters also, what are the most important things that they can do to protect deer from getting CWD?
Yeah. No, some of the most important things I like to break down. So testing for CWD, or at least reporting clinical animals so they can be tested eventually, is really, really important. As I said, it helps us determine distribution, the prevalence of the disease within that area. It also serves to gain a peace of mind, as we had talked about the potential zoonotic potential that may be demonstrated a few years from now or later on down the road. For hunters that are looking to eat the carcasses that they have that come out of zones, or whether they don't come out of zones at all. But it also, that test allows us to better inform our management actions, more efficiently mitigate the disease over time. And it also allows us to get some insight on that individual property, just in case landowners want to manage for CWD. And that's something that our biologists and Mitch and I can all, we can assist with. So certainly testing and reporting clinical animals. Another one is responsibly disposing of carcass parts. So leaving the most infectious parts behind at the site of harvest or disposed of in a type 1 landfill, or burying on your own property are some ways that we can reduce the risk of scavengers and other species. Prions have been discovered in scavenging and predator species. So reducing access of those infectious materials can help reduce the spread. And then also for taxidermists, responsible disposal of carcass parts and contaminated waste products at landfills, and certainly disinfection of tools and surfaces between each taxidermy product can also help stop the spread of CWD. And then lastly, I think that education is a huge role, a huge thing that people can not only do to educate themselves, but also educate people that can have the power to influence CWD management. So CWD, I know, has gotten this reputation for being a more divisive topic. It's resulted in a lot of misinformation about the disease and how it can be managed. But for individuals, they can visit the USDA, National Wildlife Health Center, Texas Animal Health Commissions, and Parks and Wildlife sites to learn more about the biology of disease. But they can also look up research from Texas Tech, Texas A&M, and other universities about the biological effects of CWD, next generation diagnostics, genetics, whatever. And then, I mean, reaching out to representatives, letting them know about the importance of CWD management and kind of the repercussions of not managing it. So there's a lot of things that people can do, but testing, proper, responsible disposal, and education, really kind of the three that I boil it down to.
Hey, that's great. Yeah, I can imagine with something that's as scary and potentially impactful as CWD that there are a lot that, like you say, that it could be a divisive topic. So I'm glad that you listed some places where people can go to get some facts, because we want people to learn the facts and the science and to have the right information rather than listening to opinion on this.
Yeah, no, and a lot of the times it's not meant out of malice or anything like that.
Sure.
But certain stories can certainly catch social media and take it by storm. And we're just here to try and provide some more reliable sources.
Yeah.
So with so many people researching CWD currently, is there any new exciting or hopeful research that's been coming forward?
Yeah, no. So kind of like how I had what I mentioned earlier, we collaborate with a lot of universities, not just here in Texas, but also across the United States, cutting edge research on a variety of different topics. And we've submitted around 6,000 biological samples just in the last couple of years in support of those. But there's some exciting areas that we're investigating or interested in. One of them is the genetic susceptibility, as I was talking about earlier, of animals to CWD infection. We're working with Dr. Chris Seabury at Texas A&M, as well as with the support of USDA, on kind of refining that technology, and then also pursuing breeding strategies that can maybe make captive herds less susceptible in general to CWD infection, and then also maybe using this approach to clean up currently infected herds. Another one that we're actually working with Dr. Rodrigo Morales' lab at the University of Texas has to do with strain typing and amplification assays. So these amplification assays are actually they're highly sensitive. They're called RT-QuIC and PMCA. And it's going to offer us a whole array of being able to detect disease earlier within individual animals, but also possibly do pretty efficient environmental sampling to see if there are CWD prions on a certain property or not. And we are also looking to try and use those same technologies to better characterize and discern different pathophysiology and clinical sign, or how clinical signs develop across different strains within Texas. And another one is we're actually copper and zinc. We're working with Texas A&M Kingsville, as well as MinPro, or Minnesota Prion Research and Outreach, investigating the role of copper and zinc supplementation in feed and how it impacts prion propagation. There's evidence to suggest that deficiencies in both those ions or those metals can actually lead to neurodegenerative diseases in humans. So seeing how if supplementation at higher levels of both of these metals can actually maybe slow the progression or prevent infection to begin with.
Wow, that's interesting stuff. Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned those labs. So that I'm sorry, say it again.
No, many brands in the fire.
Yeah, well, that's great. I'm sure that's how you got to get at something like this. Just try to figure it out from all different angles, and surely somebody will hit on something that works.
Yeah, no, and we're really optimistic to try and use this research to create basically more effective and more efficient management options. And if it provides a means of being able to keep free ranging and captive populations healthy in the future, I think it's well worth it.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, well, that's interesting. So we've been talking about a lot of not so fun stuff, things with serious implications. But we have a fun question that we always ask everybody. We ask for what we call a biology blunder, where just something went awry in the field and you end up with something really funny in the end. Do you have a biology blunder that you could share with us?
Well, I don't know too much about Blender, but I do spend a lot of time in the field. But I guess one of the situations I always run in here, this is my office here at one of our state natural areas, especially as we get in the hunting season. I'll be doing these Zoom calls, I'll be doing these Teams calls, and I always have to kind of look over my shoulder or not, because we have our public hunts going on, and we actually have hunters quartering at deer, and we test for CWD on these properties. So for others that are less, hunting inclined, or don't necessarily see animals getting processed on the daily, can be a little bit shocking. So I have to kind of watch out for that.
Yeah, that could be an interesting backdrop. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else you'd like to talk to us about? Anything about CWD or deer or your work in general?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm just happy to be on today, and really excited to see that there's an interest in managing chronic wasting disease, and people really are engaged in the conversation here in Texas, and really getting people to report these clinical deer, test for CWD, do proper carcass disposal, and really educate themselves are kind of the main messages I really want to get across today. But also, if there's any questions that remain, or if anyone wants to get in contact with me or the Texas Wildlife Department, contacting their local Parks and Wildlife biologists on our webpage is really one of the best means by which to get access to that information. And if there's any questions as to how individual can better manage for that disease, I'm more than happy to help in that cause.
That's great. I have a question that I didn't warn you about, but we should ask you, because I think you have an interesting, really interesting job with sort of a specialized niche. A lot of folks want to be veterinarians, and I've heard folks talk about they want to be a zoo veterinarian, but can you give us an idea how many wildlife veterinarians are there out there, or what % of veterinarians become a wildlife veterinarian? And how would you get into this line of work if this is what you really wanted to do for young people out there?
Yeah, no. So I know I was frankly, there's not a lot of us out there. I think of those actually going into the regulatory route or this free ranging wildlife medicine maybe accounts for a % or 2 of an entire graduating class of veterinary students, or at least those were the stats when I graduated some years ago. But I stumbled into this profession. So I actually, a lot of my experiences with dairy cattle, large animal production species, more of the, what do you want to say, food animal mindset. But I really got engaged in population medicine, and took a lot of advantage of these regulatory opportunities with, I worked with USDA up in Minnesota. I also worked with the Food and Agricultural Organization in the United Nations. So some less, what do you want to say, cookie cutter routes of veterinary medicine. But I really enjoyed my time, especially over at Texas Animal Health Commission, getting some experience in South Texas. But yeah, wildlife, I mean, I've been a conservation-minded person from the beginning. I'm a big hunter and outdoorsman, fisher too. Love bird hunting with my dogs. And that's how I guess I naturally found my way over to this side of the equation. But yeah, it's a harder route, but we certainly offer a lot of opportunities for veterinarians, veterinary students actually to actually internship with us. So we always keep that opportunity open because I know it's not an easy route to get into. So helping those that are actually interested in it is one of the biggest priorities for Dr. Sarah Wyckoff and I, as we go forward with our wildlife health program here at Texas Parks and Wildlife.
Great. I was just going to ask you if there are internships or anything, because obviously you've got to get the DVM. You have to become the doctor of veterinary medicine, but I'm still not sure like how you would get into wildlife. Would you look for interesting internships along the way, or as an undergraduate, like before you went to vet school, or what would you suggest?
Yeah, in veterinary school, it's certainly easier to get on the front end before you get bogged down in classes and try and figure it out while you're there, learning what you need to. But obviously, if anyone keeps their mind open, they can make the pivot just as much as I did. But as far as experience, I mean, working with any state agency or wildlife health program of Parks and Wildlife here or another state is one of the primary opportunities that I think really would get the basic skills to really pursue this type of profession. But obviously the clinical mindset as well comes in handy, especially as we translocate animals throughout the state, just engaging with a bunch of different species that we have here in Texas. So certainly internships with zoo wildlife medicine can certainly help with this in pursuing this route as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's really interesting. Well, thank you so much for spending time with us today. I enjoyed learning about the state of the CWD in Texas, but also learning about your career and your job. And it sounds like a really exciting thing. I'm sure there's never a dull moment. Maybe it is. Do you even have a typical day?
Yeah, no. I think this week I'll be going up to Austin. We have some meetings that we have to do. We have some hiring panels, and then I have to drive all the way out to El Paso. And we were doing some bighorn sheep surveys at Elephant Mountain Wildlife Management Area, and then giving some trainings there at Franklin Mountains. So, and then I get to make I think it's around 550 miles back to San Antonio, where I live. So, certainly a busy career, but I love every minute of it.
That's great. Well, you're sure not going to get bored with schedules like that.
If I'm bored, something's terribly wrong.
That's right. Well, thank you so much. I think this has been a fun conversation, and I learned a lot, so I appreciate it.
No, thank you for having me on, and however I can help in the future, please drop a line.
Okay, thanks, Hunter. Talk on the Wild Side is a production of the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute of Texas A&M University, Kingsville. Funding for this project is provided by the Harvey Wild Sportsman Conservationist Award by the Rotary Club of Corpus Christi. Editing was completed by the talented Gabby Olivas, Andrew Lowry, and Trey Kendall. We thank the TAMAC Distance Learning Lab for all their help and cooperation.